Welcome to day 2 of the TIFF Industry Conference. I'm Karina Rotenstein, your conference programmer. Well, Twitter has been a flutter over the past 48 hours about our many sessions and comments on our live stream. So although you are absolutely not allowed to video or film or take photos inside the studio, just know that we are live streaming, and we're also super happy that you are all connecting with our online audiences via our social tags, so thank you. Tomorrow, join us at 3 p.m. for an engaging and authentic masterclass with the award-winning TV producer and comedian Larry Wilmore, hosted by TIFF's Jesse Wente. This afternoon, our masterclass with Armando Iannucci is presented by DGC Ontario. It is my honor and pleasure to welcome to the stage Bill Skolnick, the CEO and Executive Director of the DGC Ontario. Bill.
It's a great pleasure for us to be part of presenting Armando Iannucci, and who's here for his film Death of Stalin. And it's very appropriate that he's in this hall. This is the Glenn Gould Hall, and Glenn Gould was one of the very first artists in the entire world to recognize that the medium is just as important as the message. And of course, that was a Marshall McLuhan premise, and he's also from Toronto, and Woody Allen was a big fan of Marshall McLuhan, and Armando Iannucci is a big fan of Woody Allen, so the circle is now complete. So if you ever see Veep, you will note that the message and how that message gets out, the medium, the way it does, is as important as anything else. So with that, we welcome Armando Iannucci to chat with us and to hear what he has to say. And I'd like to point out that this film that he has takes a look at a very, very serious aspect of history. And a similar film, Life is Beautiful, many years ago, did the same thing, and it won a big award. So the same luck to him as well.
Beautifully said, absolutely. Trey Parker refers to South Park as the satire of extremism on all sides, and Armando Iannucci described Veep as an exaggeration of what really happens. This year in particular, we have seen satirists rise to the forefront, confronting establishments in order to disarm despots and inform the masses, primarily, but not limited to, late-night television. However, our special guest, Armando Iannucci, has been satirizing our world for years, with seminal work in radio, television, and film, including In the Loop, The Thick of It, and of course, Veep. His natural curiosity and experimentation with the comedy form is why his work stands ahead of the pack, and he is also an actor's dream. Thankfully, he has returned to cinema to contribute an important and funny film, The Death of Stalin, part of TIFF's prestigious platform program. To all the budding satirists in the room and to those who are fans, this session is for you. This afternoon's masterclass is hosted by Glenn Kenny. He is an author, writer, and film critic for RogerEbert.com. I would like to welcome Glenn Kenny to the stage and the one, the only, Armando Iannucci.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's settle in, get comfortable.
It has come full circle because I'm a huge fan of Glenn Gould.
As am I.
And I have those recordings where, you know, I tell my daughter to turn up the sound and listen in, and you can hear him humming and doing all these yatata as he tries to play.
A great tradition. Thelonious Monk does that. Keith Jarrett does what we call at home the Snoopy noises. Do you have the Brahms piano concerto with the Leonard Bernstein introduction saying, I don't agree with how the pianist wants to do this piece, but we're going to do it this way anyway. It's a fascinating from the, I guess, the 50s, amazing recording. Glenn Gould was an incredible artist, icon, Canadian. And we're glad to be, I mean, it's a beautiful stage, it's a beautiful theater, so we're both glad to be here. So we'll just sit here for a while. And think about it.
Talk about stuff.
Absorb it.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about your origins as a satirist. When did you first feel the twinge of the satiric nerve?
no, it's interesting because I have a problem with the word satirist because it makes it sound like that's your occupation.
Sure.
You know, and I still, if somebody says satirist, I still have this image of someone in black and white resembling Peter Cook and Dudley Moore and doing impressions of prime ministers, and I don't know, but I can tell you that I was always drawn to, I was a big fan of Charles Dickens, and I loved the fact that he took the novel but felt that the novel should be about the world you were in and should portray not just individuals but the society they moved in and start portraying what was wrong with the society or what was absurd about it. I loved that. I was drawn to films with big themes like Dr. Strangelove and Brazil, Terry Gilliam film, which is one of my all-time favorite, and The Great Dictator, Charlie Chaplin film, about Hitler, which he did in 1941. So that's him taking on, like, you know, an enormous subject and trying to be funny about it, but also, you know, having a message. So I always felt that I was always drawn to those. Those were, and the other thing was I always knew I wanted to do comedy. You know, I didn't have a particular role in mind. It's not that I wanted to be a comic actor or a comic writer or a comic director. I just wanted to do comedy, make funny things. And I started off making funny things as a student live, but very soon getting into radio and sort of local radio in Scotland. And you know, as anyone who's worked in local radio knows, it's a fabulous training ground because you're expected to do a bit of everything because there is no money. So, you know, you do have, but so I presented programs, I did music shows, but I was allowed to write, I was allowed to get other people in and direct them and write funny pieces and use sound effects and use the radio library to find the music, and I ended up working with editors, and so I learned my kind of craft there. Really.
Right, because when you have an idea of what you want to do, you're then put in a position where you have to learn the technology in order to do it.
Yes.
To make audio collages, you have an idea in your head, but you need to get the razor blade, which is how it was done back in the day. Were you familiar, did you ever hear of an American group of audio collages called Negative Land?
No.
Some of the stuff that, your radio stuff is very interesting. They would take outtakes from Casey Kasem, you know, yelling about U2, and make collages of different sorts that were kind of musical, but also very pointed social satire.
Yeah. And they kind of, online, that sort of technique is much easier to do now.
The material is easier to find.
Easier to find. You can just grab anything. But at the time, as I say, you know, you were physically, I remember working through the night, really, cutting up bits of commentators to make them sound like they were talking gibberish, but you were physically chopping it and sticking it together, and then you dropped a piece and you've had to find it and stick it in, and then it was on back to front, and you know.
There was one bit where you had Mark E. Smith, the lead singer of The Fall, in a kind of a audio battle with a tramp or something.
A tramp, yes, that's right.
Talk about splitting the difference a bit.
Yeah.
Mark E. Smith is a rather famously drunk musician.
Yes. But I don't miss that old technology when people say, I wish it was like it. No, it was cumbersome, and you knew at the time that this was old-fashioned and obsolete, you know.
You did feel a little cooler, though, because that material kind of circulated like samizdat. It wasn't all over the place.
Exactly. But now, of course, you can do it at home. You can do it, and then you just press upload, and
Buddy Rich chastising his musicians on YouTube, you know, or things like that. Yeah. Let's talk about the two series before we get into the Death of Stalin. The Thick of It and In the Loop. I want you to talk a little bit about how you learned how to direct large ensembles, because both of those series are reliant on ensemble cast and meshing together and creating not just a satiric tweaking of authority, but an entire world.
Right.
Both of your series are not just about, you know, tweaking authority, but about the worlds of authority and the worlds of politics and how terrible things happen, and who are the people involved in them. So I want you to talk a little bit about how you first conceived Thick of It and how you rose to the challenge of directing that amazing ensemble and then coming to the States and doing Veep.
Okay. Right. I'm trying to think. Well, very often your circumstances determines how you're going to make something. And a new station had opened, a digital channel had opened up in the BBC called BBC 4, and it had no money. And I knew that I wanted to do something. I had done a documentary about Yes Minister. I don't know if any of you know this show, Yes Minister. Fantastic show. Still stands the test of time. Watch it. Brilliantly written, brilliantly performed, and it's the same old topics that just keep coming. I thought, why don't we have something like this now? And if Yes Minister was all about the minister being prevented by his civil servant, his public servant, from doing anything, I thought now it's more the minister prevented from doing something by the forces around him or her, whether it's his advisors or whether it's the prime minister or it's the media, the 24-hour media cycle, and their obsession with the media and getting the message out. That was how I wanted to reconfigure it. Because BBC 4 had no money, I thought, okay, why don't we make something that is very quick and cheap to make? Why don't we it's basically a cast of 6 or 7 people in suits in a set of offices, 2 cameras, handheld. We won't even bother with putting marks down. We'll get the whole place lit generally, a little bit of improvisation, and we'll try and shoot it as fast as we can, not just for budget reasons, but also because that world I'm trying to show is a world of non-stop clock ticking. You haven't got time to think. You've just got to say something because somebody shoved a camera in your face and a microphone at your mouth, and you just say something and you've accidentally said the wrong thing, so now you've got to think about how you can take back what you've just said and that. And so actually I didn't want the actors to think too much about how they were going to deliver the lines. I didn't want them to perform it as such. I wanted them to just blurt it out. And I encouraged them to talk over each other and to just get through it as fast as possible. And we shot, in 7 days, we shot 3 episodes. And then the program took off and the cast became very famous and the budget went right up. But deservedly show for them. And I suppose what I was looking for in the cast are people who are, my audition technique, as it were, is to get them to stay in character while I fire questions at them. And I tell them, I'm not expecting you to be funny. We have writers. We will give you jokes. We'll give you funny lines. I just want to see if you're comfortable staying as that character and are comfortable doing that even if something entirely new has come up. So Peter Capaldi, who came in to be Malcolm Tucker, I remember saying to him, I want you to fire me. I'm a government cabinet minister. I want you to ask me to resign. Be pleasant. I will resist. Choose your moment to stop being pleasant and start being unpleasant. And that's what he did. And the moment he started being unpleasant, I thought, okay, I found Malcolm Tucker here. This is quite frightening. Can you stop now, please? And then actually Peter told me he was in a very bad mood that day because he'd just been to another audition that hadn't gone well. And he was thinking of just giving up. And he just thought, I'll just do one more. But, and the fucker hasn't even sent me a script. He wants me to improvise. And so he was in a foul mood. And it's that, because I want to find, you talk about an ensemble. I want to find people who are comfortable being part of an ensemble. And that very often involves you being generous as a performer. And I've noticed this with two people I've worked very closely with, is Julia Louis-Dreyfus and Steve Coogan. And both of them are very generous performers because if they have a funny idea, they will be the first to say, do you know what? I think you should say that. I think that would be funnier coming from you. I think I'll just, and that's a mark of their professionalism, really, because they know ultimately the better the program or the better the film, the better the show, then everyone will get the credit. It's not a fight for who's got the funniest lines.
Yeah. When you came to the States and did Veep, I noticed there's a bit of a difference in the way that the two shows were structured. In the thick of it, it seemed slightly more conventionally structured in that every episode was a self-contained
Yeah.
episode. With Veep, you have more of a free-flowing, ongoing documentary
Yes.
kind of style, where, I mean, each episode is very satisfying on its own, but there's also
Yes.
a line.
Well, that was HBO. They said, look, I mean, most network sitcoms in America are 22 episodes, 26 episodes sometimes. And they're very much written as self-contained because they don't expect you to see every one of them. If you miss one, it doesn't matter. It's the same group of people the following week doing roughly the same things, he says, simplifying the entire American sitcom network tradition that's actually created lots of works of magnificence. But what HBO said, we don't do that. We don't do 22 episodes, 26. We do 8 or 10. So we need people to want to come back the following week. So, you know, it'd be great if every episode was self-contained, but if every season had its own characteristic. And they gave us the example, Curb Your Enthusiasm. There's the season where he was putting on the producers. There was a season where he was like going to open a restaurant. You know, it's just a way of defining that and it making you, you know, build up your interest so that you would come back the following week. And that was that was the first time I'd actually started to look at that idea. And I learned a lot from it. And we had one more series of The Thick of It to do after my first season of Veep. And I actually fed that into the final series of The Thick of It. And we plotted not just the episodes, but how each episode was actually building up to something, which was like a big inquiry, kind of like a trial at the end, so that actually you were rewarded for your kind of viewing of the whole thing. And that's it's a great, I mean, it makes it harder to write because you're doing two things at once. You're doing the episode, but you're also doing the bigger story. But I think it's more satisfying, actually.
Now, I'm sure when we get to the Q&A with the audience, somebody will ask a question about this topic, but I'm going to come at it from the side for a bit. But since Donald Trump became president, one thing that you've seen happen with people on the internet.
I'm way behind.
Essentially,
how does it end?
Essentially, with every public verbal atrocity, someone will make a video where it'll be the end credits of a particular Veep episode.
Okay, yeah.
This is now the norm. But that end credit sequence where something, the end credits are unfolding while something unusually appalling is happening. How did you happen upon that device?
Well, it's just, I like, HBO have given me, 29 and a half minutes. I want to make the best use of that. So I don't want the comedy to stop with 1 minute to go so that we can do the credits. So I run the credits while the dialogue is playing out. And I just find that satisfying because I know people will go back and we've got the option now to stop it and pause it and go back and play it again. And so it doesn't really matter. You've got two things going on simultaneously. And I just find that satisfying. Yes, Trump. He's the dead elephant in the room, isn't he? I'm so glad I'm not doing Veep now, actually, because and they've quite cleverly taken Selena away from Washington, because how you can try and, in a comedic, I mean, the thing about Trump is he is, satire, to get back to what we're talking about at the top, is satire is taking what's true and then twisting it and stretching it and bending it round and, making it an unusual shape. But that's what he does anyway in any of his tweets and his, he just has this bizarre use of, he talks in these individual words. He talks about China, because I say, and I'm telling you, he starts 3 or 4 sentences at once, and I say, and no, and I tell you, and she said to me, terrific, and it just, and there's nowhere, you can't grasp what, he each one of his tweets the first 3 words are fine, they're absolutely fine. If you stopped after 3 words, they'd be fine. They're like a plane sort of taxiing, and it's fine. And then each sentence then takes off, and then it does a kind of loop-the-loop. And And then as that's happening, another plane is taking off. And then they crash and kill lots of people. So there's no, he's his own satirist. He's a self-basting satirist, and therefore, and it's interesting that comedians actually who have impacted most on dealing with Trump are the ones who actually have become journalists.
Yeah.
Trump has said that all news is fake news, so it's now the comedians who are saying, okay, we'll make you laugh by just presenting the facts. Here's what he said, and here's what he said 3 years ago. Here's what he said he would do. Here's what he actually did. And, and they actually use teams of researchers and bring proper forensic journalistic practice to their comedy. And that seems to be the comedy that works as a proper response to what Trump is doing.
My favorite thing he did recently was talking about Hurricane Irma, and he was talking about the potential devastating impact, and he said, believe me, it's not, as if he were some kind of authority.
Yeah. Believe me,
Believe me, this is going to be bad. It's like,
I look
yes,
out at the Glen Gould Theatre and
you're the one.
I see at least 3 million people here, and it's extraordinary. Only for me.
Let's talk about the film work.
Yes.
Taking the thick of it and distilling portions of it for a feature film, In the Loop, in which you brought in the component of American politics, American warfare. And how did that come about, and what did you learn in the process of kind of bringing that down to the structure?
It came about because I always wanted to do something that responded to the invasion of Iraq, because I felt it was so. Here's the thing: when Blair, and indeed Bush, but from my perspective in the UK, Blair was saying that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and we have to go in because he could set them off within 45 minutes. Everyone was saying that's nonsense. And everyone was saying, if you do this, it will just create a mess. And yet he did it anyway. And it was a mess, and it turned out to be nonsense. And it's still, the ramifications of it are still, unfurling. And what intrigued me really was, how did that happen? How did one person just get this idea, and yet the electorate, the establishment, those in power, the military, were unable to stop that person from doing it? And then, you start digging around, and then you realize that what had happened was that the British had got kind of starstruck by the Americans, that they were going out to Washington and sitting down with Bush. And our foreign secretary was excited that he was in the Oval Office, And when I did In the Loop, I said, when we were shooting the Washington scenes, I said to our British cast, remember the first time you went to LA as an actor? And everyone was saying how excited they were to see you, and tremendous, you're going to have all these meetings, you're going to set the world on fire, you're going to be so excited, and nothing happened. And you went home bitterly disappointed. Do that as the Brits going to Washington, and that's what because that was what happened. And that made you think, of course, these people, they're human beings. They're not, we put them on these pedestals as politicians, and we assume that they know what they're doing, but they're like us, We can get starstruck, and we can get tired, and we can get confused, and, and that's really the story. And also, I then started researching. I remember one guy from the CIA told us, that America got all its best intelligence from the Baghdad newspapers. They were far more accurate than any of the CIA on the ground in Iraq. But he also said, I work at the CIA. I'm in an office with a chair and a computer, and it's a bit. And I always had this fantasy that someone would come and tap me on the shoulder and say, see over there? Through there is the room with all the big screens and the stuff you see on Homeland and so on. He said it never happened. It didn't exist, Yeah. So it was that, finding out that, behind these big, impressive buildings in Washington are actually just people going, I don't know. What do we do? I don't know. Should we invade? I don't know. Should we? It's that. And it's funny, but it's also shocking. And little things like, I've told the story before, but I managed to get into the State Department without any security pass because a journalist said, I had a BBC pass, which was just my photograph with the words BBC next to it, which, a child of 4 could have come up with. But they said, if you go up to the front desk at the State Department and say, BBC, I'm here for the 12:30, they'll let you in. And that's exactly what happened. And I was wandering around the State Department. I thought, well, we need references, visual references for my art department. I'll start taking photos. So I'm sort of wandering around the State Department taking photos, thinking, this is A, exciting, but B, international espionage. And a huge guy turned up and went, excuse me, can I help? And I said, I'm here for the 12:30. And he went, oh, it's over there. And I went in, and it was Condoleezza Rice's press briefing. But again, and it was the little things. They told me at the State Department, because in America they don't like spending money on federal buildings, because that's evil, apparently. Anything the government does is evil. So the furniture is really shoddy in the State Department, and they have desks and chairs that don't match. They have chairs that are too high. The arms of the chairs are too high for their desks, so you can't, so everyone at the State Department is doing that, and or in the West Wing. We went around the West Wing when we were researching Veep, and everyone loves to say they work at the West Wing, but there's no room. And really, there are far bigger offices in other buildings, but they don't want those. They want to say they work in the West Wing. So you get kind of, generals and people in their 50s sitting on little chairs in a corridor with their laptop so they can say they work in the West Wing. And Jonah in Veep, it's true, we met that guy because he said, I work in the West Wing, and what I really love is when I ring up someone and say, hi, I'm calling from the West Wing, you can hear the other person going, it's the West Wing. And he says, I do, since I started work at the West Wing, I used to date 6s and 7s, but now it's 8s and 9s I date, That's what he said. Yeah. But it's finding those little, the sort of mundane details that I find funnier and probably truer than the kind of the Hollywoodized version of it being a big kind of glamorous place.
Because of those budgets, the evils of spending, so much of the actual federal government runs on essentially dial-up modems and things like that.
Yeah.
It's incredibly.
The Wi-Fi is terrible in the White House. Yeah.
Because federal spending is evil.
But they love television. They love film.
Yes.
Because when I was shown around by Reggie Love, who is Obama's personal assistant, and he showed me, and he said, this is the Roosevelt room. This would be where CJ and Josh would sit. And I said, why are you referencing the TV show, The West Wing? This is The West Wing. You are CJ and Josh. Why don't you say this is where President Barack Obama would sit down to have a meeting with Hillary Clinton? It's like they don't get it. They love the glamorous kind of the outside world looking at them.
People said that Jean Baudrillard was pretentious, but he was actually right about a lot of things, that there is no reality, or that people have just gotten...
Well, especially now, reality is inconvenient.
Yeah.
So reality, whatever can be expressed in 140 characters is the reality we have to contend with now.
Let's discuss The Death of Stalin, which was based on a graphic novel by Fabienne Nury and Thierry Robin. Is that how you discovered it, or...?
Yes. French producers Quad production company who had done great films, and Untouchable and
Intouchable.
Intouchable. And I think there's an English language version of it. It's being premiered.
Yes, my friend Neil Berger directed that. Yeah,
which I hear is very good. Yeah. They owned the rights to the graphic novel, and they got in touch with me, and they said, in fact, they came over to London and they sat me down and said, we want you to make this film. And I said, that's very kind, but I'm doing Veep. I read it, and I thought, yes, this is great, fantastic story, but I'm doing Veep. And they said, we'll wait. So, I mean, how good is that? So when I knew that my time on Veep was coming to an end, I knew that season 4 was going to be my last one, I got back in touch and said, okay, let's do it. So that was the starting point for it. And I, at the time, had been thinking anyway about my next project being something about, not necessarily a dictator, but about authority figures. You know, how do people hold an entire country under their spell just by dint of their personality? Or how can one person terrorize an entire community? So I was sort of coincidentally looking at that, and then the Stalin story. And the great thing about the book is that it is based on true events. It opens with a concert where it's being played live on Radio Moscow. A pianist is playing a Mozart piano concerto. Head of Radio Moscow gets a phone call. It's Stalin. I'm enjoying the concert. I'd love a recording. I'll have someone round to pick it up. Puts the phone down, turns to the engineer and says, "Are we recording this?" And he says, "No." And he thinks, "Oh my God." Because people lived under fear of Stalin. If you did the wrong thing, made the wrong reference, if you even accidentally put a coffee mug down on a picture of Stalin on the newspaper and a neighbor saw that and reported you, you could be taken off to prison, the gulag, or shot. So anyway, the engineer just runs out. The audience are leaving. He shouts, "Shut the doors." He tries to encourage them all to come back in. He says, "We're going to play this again, and this time we're going to record it for Stalin." At which point the pianist says, "No, you're not. He killed my father. He killed my brother. I'm not doing it." They manage to persuade her to do it, but the conductor is so scared by this time that he faints, and he knocks himself unconscious against something on the wall. So now they have no conductor. So then they have to scour Moscow for another conductor late at night who comes in and does it in his pajamas. And that's all true.
Yeah.
All true. And in fact, in reality, the next conductor they got in was drunk, so they actually had to get a third conductor. But I didn't put that in because I thought people wouldn't believe it. But the fact that it's all true just added to, and it's a comedy, but it's a comedy of people who are terrified and who are, and within the Kremlin, people who are paranoid that they might say or do the wrong thing.
Relatively commonplace. You've made a lot of television and film about people who have the power to cause death. In this film, they can commit murder. They'll commit murder themselves, or stand and watch while murders are committed. And these incredible, almost absurdist Kafkaesque scenarios you're talking about were relatively commonplace during Stalin's regime. Now, but you co-wrote with Ian Martin, is that correct? And you follow the outline of the graphic novel relatively closely, but you do a lot lot of drawing outside the margins.
Okay, yes,
no,
because
that's not a criticism. It's just an
no.
observation.
But when you take anything, what you don't do when you're adapting something is say, I have to reproduce this in another medium. I think it's better. I think it's more respectful of the original if you're trying to stay true to the tone of the original. But if you're working in another medium, things are different. In the book, it's very sequential, and the second half takes place 3 months later, and it's a series of meetings, which reads well. But as a film, that would take all the momentum out, and then a series of meetings at the end of the film.
Sure.
So you have to then rethink that. So the big change we did really was keep all the events in the original, but have them playing almost simultaneously while the funeral is being planned and while the funeral takes place.
You blow out and you have bits, the whole business with the recording, and I'll call back in 17 minutes, and that's Paddy Considine as the recording engineer, and you almost make a who's on first kind of routine out of 17 minutes, what's going to happen in 17 minutes because of the
But then because you have more time, you see, there's in a graphic novel, there's this minimal dialogue because a lot of it is the visuals and the story. On screen, you've got a group of, and especially if you've got a magnificent cast ensemble, you've got to give them good things to say, and you've got to make each scene have its own little internal narrative and drive and beginning, middle, and end.
In the United States and Canada, our cultural processing of the Soviet Union, particularly in Stalin's era and Khrushchev's era, is heavily influenced by HUAC, Joe McCarthy, the Blacklist, the American communists who were prosecuted sometimes and went into exile sometimes. In Great Britain, from my understanding, the cultural experience of the Soviet Union has a lot to do with Kim Philby, the politician who
defected,
was a
yes,
traitor.
and the other MI5.
And also the artists in Great Britain who were not blacklisted, but all had these great political conversions, guys like John Brain, Kingsley Amis, Philip Larkin, who started out as men of the left and then became men of the right and sometimes extreme right. And I'm wondering if you, if those cultural reference played any part in how you approach the material.
No, I think it was more, you know, I said at the beginning, I talked about Glenn Gould. I'm a big classical music fan, and I love Shostakovich's music. And Shostakovich had, you know, he wrote under Stalin and somehow he became almost like a hero of the Soviet Union because he was so successful as a composer. But he then knew that limited how he could write, and then he wrote a symphony that was criticized, and then he wrote an opera, Lady Macbeth of Macbeth, which received a damning review, which was probably actually written by Stalin. And then, you know, there's a great book, Julian Barnes' novel.
Sure.
Was it Time? Oh, I forget the name.
Yeah, Time is part of the title.
Time's in the title.
Yeah.
Where, you know, Shostakovich genuinely thought he was going to be, he was going to get the knock on the door in the middle of the night and taken away. And he packed his bag and he just sat by the door every night, and it didn't happen. So I was aware of all that. So I wanted to draw on that and that paranoia and that fear, and that world was what inspired George Orwell to do his 1984 and that whole world of doublethink and so on. And then, you know, connecting it with, now we wrote this 2 years ago and we shot it last summer, so it was pre-Trump, but there was a general air of facts being manipulated I think with social media also, you know, everything feels like it's true because it looks true. You know, we're so used to newspapers being the shape of authority, but when you can just make something up but make it look like it's published by a newspaper, it somehow feels like it has some kind of weight behind it. And so there's this kind of information anarchy going on where everything looks like it might be true, even though 99% of it is false. So we're in that kind of strange world. So that's what I was interested in, really.
And you do a great bit during the end credits where you imitate the purging of people from Stalinist-era photographs, the disappearing of various individuals. There's a film that was made in Russia in the 90s by Alexei German, the great director, a very hallucinatory film called Khrushchev, My Car, about one of the doctors who was part of the, who was rounded up and tortured and disappeared during the period when Stalin died, and this doctor's actually driven out to the dacha and he sees Stalin's, and it's an insane movie. It's very hard to follow, but it's very beautifully made. And Khrushchev, My Car is, of course, what Beria says when he's calling for his chauffeur. Now, in this film, all of the different guys who are jockeying for position after the death of Stalin, Beria, Khrushchev, Molotov, you have this another ensemble cast, and you have them, all the actors speak in their own accents. And it makes sense because all over Russia people spoke differently. There's a joke that Nabokov made about, you know, as a St. Petersburg guy saying mockingly, it's great to hear Russia spoken as it was in Moscow, which is a put-down, only they don't know it. So,
and Stalin was Georgian, and Beria was Georgian, so they spoke a completely different language and dialect if they wanted to, because it was an empire. It wasn't just Russia, it was the Soviet Union. So there were all sorts of voices and dialects there, and what I didn't want to do is have our actors put on a false, fake Russian accent, which I think would have slowed down the rhythm of the dialogue anyway. But I felt it was more real to have this. So we have Irish, Scottish, Yorkshire, American.
My fellow Brooklynite, Steve Buscemi.
As Khrushchev.
It's fantastic how well it works. And it's also fantastic how much, with all this grim stuff going on, you actually incorporate some very funny physical slapstick with Beria and Khrushchev doing belly flops and that sort of thing. Did that develop in the script, or was that something that came out of the ensemble as you
It was a little bit of both. I knew I wanted to do sequences that were wordless sequences which I knew the music would carry along, and also the visuals would be where the comedy was. And then what I tend to do with most projects is, if possible, get the cast early and rehearse with them for 2 weeks. It just in a room, because it's very cheap to hire a church hall and get some biscuits in and some teas and coffees and sit with your actors for 2 weeks and work things out with the scenes. And they get to enjoy it, and they all said that they learned not only about their character, but it meant that they could learn about everyone else's character, so that when we started on day one shooting it, they felt like they'd all been through this for 15 years and they all knew each other. But also you get to work out the story in the right order, because when you're shooting, it's all out of order. So they felt, but that is where we play around, and I encourage them to not to come up with whole new improvised speeches, but just the behavior, just to try something out. And when you see them physically all together, you start getting ideas of, like, wouldn't it be funny if while he's doing this, he was looking at his watch to show he was a bit bored, but trying not to make him see him do that and all that sort of thing. That's where because yes, you can do that when you're on set, but that takes up time. And in the shoot is the most expensive part of the production. We're now, of course, talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars every day, whereas Church Hall, was it 50 quid a day? I don't know, maybe more. So, and I'm always amazed when I find out that TV shows and most movies don't do that, don't have a rehearsal period. It just strikes me as baffling. I mean, if you were putting it on stage, you would rehearse it, obviously. Why can't we do that for movies? I don't know.
Jeffrey Tambor as Malenkov seems to be in line with a lot of characters he's played, someone who's used to being humiliated, who just sort of sits and takes it. Was that what you had in mind when you cast
A little
him?
bit. I mean, the Larry Sanders Show is my all-time favorite TV show. And Hank is just a fantastic character in that. And if you haven't seen it, I'd recommend you go back. It was HBO in the 90s, that show. And Jeffrey's great because he has a bearing that looks as if he might be an authority figure, but he has an expression that looks like he's drowning, and he's able to carry those off simultaneously.
Mm-hmm. The film also foregrounds Khrushchev's actual reformist tendencies, which is not something that's treated in the graphic novel. Do you find Khrushchev a sympathetic figure in any way? Well,
except, he, like all the others, was involved in the 30s and 40s in the terror. I mean, to get to where they are, to survive, they must have had to do stuff that, they must have sold their soul somewhere to have remained alive under Stalin.
Yeah, and yet he wanted to do better.
Yeah. And part of the problem, it's once Stalin dies fairly early on in the film, there's a power struggle as to who takes over. And people know that if it's not you, then you'll be dead. So everyone wants to try and take over. And Khrushchev's plan is to be the liberal. To his great surprise, Beria, who was the chief torturer and the head of security, is also projecting himself as a liberal now. And he says, he's now releasing all the people he rounded up. He's now releasing because he wants to be popular. Yeah. So it's that turn of a 180-degree turn of character and policy around that wrong fruits Khrushchev.
And now I have some questions left, but we are honor-bound to go to the Q&A section of our program. So hopefully you'll ask some of the questions I have in mind. But the way it works is the volunteers will pick you. Neither Armando or I will pick you. You'll be picked by a volunteer. You'll be handed a mic. You will stand up, and you will hopefully ask a question and not tell a story. Not that we don't love you or want to hear your stories, but we have limited time. So volunteer.
Sorry, thanks. Pressure's on now. Nice to meet you, Armando. Thanks for being here. I just had a quick question about the writing process for The Death of Stalin. I read somewhere that for In the Loop, you split kind of it up a little bit. You sent it out to the writing team. You kind of divided it up and then put it all back together. I wasn't sure whether that was the case for this one. And then I'd also be interested to find out what you're doing next.
Okay. No, the Death of Stalin, there were about 4 of us who worked on it. I think we went through it in a much more traditional way in that we sort of chatted about we worked out the story, and then we chatted through each scene and maybe take it in turns to write it and then to swap round. But it was much more, because I knew it was a bigger beast and the resources we were using were bigger. I knew that we had to get a lot of it locked down pretty early. And also I knew a lot of the visuals would require storyboarding was the other thing I did in much more detail. And sitting down with the DOP as well, the director of photography, and actually as we were storyboarding, already discussing the moves and the shots that we might do. And then very early on, sitting with the composer as well and talking about how the music should work at certain sequences. Because I kind of knew, I had a kind of very keen sense of what the whole, hour and 40 minutes should be. Now, that's not to say there weren't room, I talked about the rehearsal process. There was room within each scene to play about with the dialogue, and we were always rewriting, and sometimes the actors would ask if they had an alternative for this, or could they try that out, and so on. So there's always room for that. But I had to keep, we were on a kind of restricted schedule, and we could only get into certain amazing locations, but, for a certain amount of time. So we had to make full use of the time there. So I couldn't have all those long conversations on set while time was running out. So that, and what was the other thing? Oh, what am I doing next? I'm doing a film next year, hopefully, of David Copperfield. I want to do another ensemble movie. And I'm going to do something for HBO pretty soon. We're just chatting about it, and it won't be set in the world of politics. It will probably be set in the future. Yeah. Ooh. If there is a future, if the future ever happens. Yes.
Tom Lehrer once said that satire became obsolete when Henry Kissinger won the Nobel Prize.
Yes.
But you've carried on. I wonder if you could comment on that.
Well, I mentioned Trump. I'm so glad I'm not doing... I find it difficult to be funny about Trump other than in analyzing his language and so on. But for me, I find the current state of politics in Washington, I find it depressing. And I feel, God love them, thankfully there are other people who can be funny about him, but I kind of feel I've said what I've had to say in a comedic way about politics in DC, and if anything, the Stalin movie is about actually reminding you that democracy is not something that once we have it forever, and it's permanent and it's rigid, and it's, you just change the mix and the dynamic, and, and it's very fragile, and it means it has to be supported and tended to every day, and maybe we've taken it for granted, and maybe we've thought, oh, why bother voting, because, it's always the same, isn't it? Well, it's not.
Yeah.
And, my father came over to the UK in 1950. He fought quite young. He fought in the partisans in Italy against fascism. And he never took a British passport. And I said, why don't you take British citizenship? Because then you can vote. And he said, well, why should I vote? The last election I remember, Mussolini got in, so that's what happens. So you have to be, so I find myself now wanting to, we had an election pretty recently in the UK, which actually came up with a deliciously surprising result. And I spent quite a lot of time trying to persuade young voters to re-engage and to register and to vote, which they did, not because of me, but just because I think a lot of them didn't in the Brexit referendum, and then woke up and realized, I see. So actually, it does make a difference if you vote. So the following year when the election happened, they came out in huge numbers to vote.
I just had a quick question in terms of using like a strict script versus a detailed plot analysis that allows some room. I guess what would you say would you find the biggest advantage of using like a detailed plot analysis with room for improvisation, and the biggest challenge?
Well, it sort of depends what the project is. You know, some things, I explained how the thick of it, the budgetary constraints determined the style in a way. Something like Stalin, which was a bigger canvas, needed a little bit more preparation and a bit more locking into place a lot of the detail. So I don't think there's a hard and fast rule about, you know. I find it kind of useful if you're doing maybe as a one-off, as a movie thing, just to try and summarize the story and go back and then try and add more detail to that summary, because it sorts out in your head some of the issues. You know, you suddenly realize, oh, we've lost a character. You know, the character started there and they're gone for like 30 minutes. So let's go back and try and look at that scene again and feed that character back into it, you know.
There's something over there? Yeah.
Hi.
Oh, hello.
Hi, I wanted to talk a little bit about the cast. It was an amazing cast filled with these actors who are just famous for playing amazing characters. These were real people who were also kind of larger-than-life characters.
We're talking about the Death of Stalin?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Did you have any of these people in mind when you were bringing these, you know, dead Russians back to life?
Back to life. I always thought of Simon Russell Beale for Beria. And he's well known in the UK as a great stage actor, but he's done very few. He's done the odd cameo in movies, but he's more famous as a stage actor. But I had him in mind as Beria. And then once I knew that we had Simon, it was then a case of, I sort of cast bit by bit, because it's such a carefully balanced structure that everyone has to feel that they complement perfectly everyone else. So I kind of do it one at a time. So I don't have a kind of ideal cast list across that. I always start with the central characters. So once we had Beria, right, who's the right Khrushchev to this Beria? And once we had Steve, and physically they look very different, and it's a good kind of, okay, we then go to the others around them, and that's when the idea starts. So I don't start with these are the 12 people I want in the film. It's more, it's a slower process. So I just take my time over it, and I kind of doing one at a time. And then once we've got that character, you can then move on to the next character and start the process again. But it does take longer that way. But I feel it then means you arrive at a group of people who feel sort of coherent, feel that they all have different... And I do like bringing together people from different acting traditions. So, I mean, Paul Whitehouse is in the film. He's really a comic... not stand-up, but a comedy actor. Jeffrey Tambor obviously has his kind of television background. Simon, as I said, is a stage actor. Michael Palin has the whole, Python history. I do like the idea of bringing people in from different acting traditions, really. So it doesn't feel like everyone speaks with the same voice.
Yeah. Simon Russell Beale doesn't do a lot of film, but when you see him in a film, you don't forget him. He's also in Terence Davies' Deep Blue Sea as the husband, and he's just remarkable in that.
Yeah.
We have a question from over here.
I'm actually from the company that bought the film for the distribution in Russia.
Aha,
and you wouldn't believe what reaction did even the trailer got there. Like
yes. What is the reaction? What is the reaction?
Well, I'm prohibited from telling stories, but I guess it's an exception. So,
okay.
Well, Russian Communist Party, current Communist Party, issued the note of protest to the Ministry of Culture, Russian Ministry of Culture. And that's just one of the examples. Well, first, I want to say thank you for the film, and especially thank you for the end credits, which is like embodiment of all those horrors that Russian society went through during the last century or so. The question, though, is, like a Russian, I can see like some anachronisms there and some, differences and so on. But I presume that your aim and your goal was not to show precisely Russian society in the year of 1953, but rather to show the portrait of the nature of dictatorship or tyranny in the world, correct?
Yes,
right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, What would be your director's statement about that?
Well, but we did go to great lengths to get the look absolutely right. And I went over to Moscow and looked around Stalin's dacha and the Kremlin, and we recreated as much as we could the look then. I mean, Stalin's interesting because his dacha, he wasn't into luxury and ostentation. He, his dacha has very threadbare. It has a little tiny bed and a desk and some curtains. And he was interested in power, but he wasn't interested in money, really. So when you see in the film the dacha, it's a dark kind of wooden place, big rooms, but slightly empty, slightly not as much furniture as you meant. So I wanted to get the look right. I wanted to get that period right, and we went out and we filming all around Eastern Europe to get all the vehicles right and the costume. So it was that. But you're absolutely right. It's not saying this is a film that's just about then. It's saying this is what happens when power goes bad, when it gets concentrated in one person, and where the people exercising power are more interested in their own survival than in what is going to happen throughout the country, really. And it's also about the manipulation of information and knowledge and rewriting history and telling people who supported one thing to suddenly change their support for a completely different set of values.
Yeah. No fancy bed, but you can make a phone call and say, I want a recording of that concert, and know you would get it. That's the ultimate aphrodisiac for a person like that. We have time for one more question. I guess there's...
Hi, thanks for your film. It was really great. I just wanted you to talk a little bit about political satire as a genre of writing, because it's so hard. I know you didn't write the script, but I know you kind of... Did you co-write it with another person?
Yeah, there's four of us on the
So I just wanted the research, the approach, like how does one write a political satire?
I mean, it's, again, political, what is political? You have to start with the subject. What is the subject? What is the area? What is, something like this? Well, we need to go to Moscow. We need to see what it was like. We need to look in our history books. We need to try and talk to people who maybe were around at the time. David, one of the writers, told me he knew someone who, at the time of all the rounding ups, they said actually a good tip was to wear lots of layers of clothes when you went to bed, so that if you were pulled out of your house in the middle of the night, at least you had lots of warm clothes on. So people would go to bed with just different layers. Things like that, those details and so on. But I think you have to start with I can only tell you how I do it, which is to start with the reality of it. What is it we're trying to show here? What's the world? Okay, let's research this world and find out where the absurdity is or the comedy is or what the power structures are. In the same way that I was saying earlier, when you went around the State Department, you realize that they're all in cheap furniture, and therefore what's that saying about the system that they're in? So there's no hard and fast rule. I think it's all launched really by the subject, and that subject will then determine the method and the technique and how you go about doing it.
And that's all the time we have. The hour has flown by. I want to thank Armando and thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you. It's been fun. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Armando and Glenn. And thank you for joining us. Please join us in the lounge for cocktails and keep the conversation going. Yes. Thank you.